Right, so I usually stay away from influencer boxing. I find the whole thing ridiculous. The pay-per-views are usually a rip-off, right? And it's always the preamble and all the talking before the fight. That's usually way more interesting than the fight. Like influencer boxing typically just ends up being like a clinch fest. But today, we got some news that relates directly to MMA. We got some interesting news from Most Valuable Promotions, and I know that this take and what I'm going to say is going to really annoy the die-hard Diaz army that just seems to follow Nate Diaz wherever he goes, but I do believe it, and I am not just trolling you, okay? So before we get into my take on it and your feedback, let's just set the table here so we all know exactly what we're talking about. Tweet comes out from Bloody Elbow, and the PFL and Jake Paul have sent a deal to Nate Diaz for a rematch in the cage in PFL MMA, and I mean PFL MMA. Now, what are your thoughts on that, fam? Leave that down in the comments because we are now in the world of MMA, and I have said early on when this news came out last year that if the PFL do a special pay-per-view card with Francis Ngannou and Jake Paul and Nate Diaz on it, that is big money, right? That is the kind of money that will give Dana White a bloody brain tumor. And if it happens, okay, just again, firstly, if it happens, so much respect for Jake Paul for actually stepping into an MMA cage, especially against a veteran like Nate Diaz. But as for the fight itself, yeah, first glance, Nate takes Paul down and just BJJs the hell out of him, like almost murders him with a choke. Like, you guys want to see a dead body, you tune into this pay-per-view. And then at least Dana White will have something to smile about on the day that this actually happens. But, Nate Diaz is the kind of fighter that would just rather stand and bang and just throw like a Hail Mary takedown at the end of the fight. I mean, we know that because that's literally what he did in boxing. But look at the way that he fought Leon Edwards. Like, Nate Diaz is quite happy to just go in there and have a bit of a punch on and have a good time. So what if you can actually rely on Nate Diaz to take this like semi-seriously and try and take him down? Well, when Nate Diaz and Jake Paul fight each other, they fight at a weight class up from Diaz, right? Jake Paul is a lot bigger and far more muscular than him. And when they're clinching and grappling and on the ground in the PFL, there's no elbows, right? So the grappling is just going to be on size and technique. It's going to be a lot tougher for Nate because it is still just dirty boxing and trying to outsize someone that's bigger than you, right? Nate should be coming in and sitting at about 170, but to fight Paul, he needs to move up to 180, and Nate Diaz's like post-testosterone producing vegan body, it doesn't stack up well against the shredded 26-year-old Jake Paul. That gives Jake Paul like a lot of help in the wrestling and in the BJJ defense, right? I am sure you guys have heard of people who go into the BJJ training room and they might not have the right technique, but they can muscle their way out of things. The Derek Lewis just get up sort of approach to defense and to takedown defense. Plus, this is the part that I know is going to annoy a lot of you. Offensive jiu-jitsu in modern MMA, it's kind of useless. A good defense can get you through a lot of sub attempts. Even in the UFC, we see a lot of submissions. But compared to how many we see attempted and defended, submissions usually come as like part of a finishing sequence after a big shot. Remember everyone, Jake Paul has been setting up his transition to MMA for well over a year now. It was officially announced that he signed a deal with the PFL on January 6th. That's when his deal was done. He's been in the gym most days of the week, barring small breaks for rest, but well over 12 months, and yes, primarily focusing on boxing. But if you think that he hasn't been working on takedown defense, wrestling, jiu-jitsu defense in preparation for his transition over to MMA, especially after he literally signed a financial contract with the PFL that guarantees that he has to fight someone in MMA at some point in the future. If you think he hasn't been training to keep his guard tight, to keep his arms all the way in or all the way out, tuck his chin, fight hands, if you think he hasn't been training all of that, I don't know what to tell you. Then he goes and he bags Nate Diaz in a boxing match and publicly calls him out and says, I will rematch you in MMA. This feels like a setup, not a setup like we're getting scammed here, not like it's all pre-written like the WWE. but a setup in the sense that Jake Paul has sat down and thought about this and planned this out. And I can see a world where a young 26-year-old Jake Paul beats Nate Diaz in MMA. I can see Jake having more speed and power on the feet, which is what he did when they had their boxing match. I can see it falling into like a messy exchange on the mat and Nate Diaz pulling defensive BJJ submissions, throwing arm bars and triangles, but not really being able to lock anything up. Jake surviving the chaos, and in all of that madness, ground and pounding Diaz, maybe not to a finish, but to score a significant amount of points in that smart cage that will count all of those ground and pounding shots. I could see a world where Jake Paul beats Nate Diaz in MMA. Okay, cue the abuse from the Diaz army. Like, bring it on. The comments are not going to be disabled on this video. I am really not trying to troll you guys. I just see this fight going a particular way, and I can really see it going in Jake Paul's favor. Or they get into some messy boxing, and in the clinch, Nate Diaz just throws a standing guillotine, and I look like an absolute fool. Guys, let me know your thoughts down there in the comments. I'm very interested to hear what you have to say about this one. And if you have been enjoying this channel, maybe consider clicking that subscribe button there. I will see you all in the next one.